Today we begin the new parak, the 9th parak of Yevamos. We have a Mishnah. You'll notice the Mishnah is a rather lengthy Mishnah. On the side of the Gemara we have our nosei, our topic heading, mivneh, structural note combined into one. A diamond will appear in this Mishnah, highlighting the word v'elu. And we will see arba kvutzos, or 4 groupings, shel halachas, or matzavim, situations, shel mutaros, or asuros, lebalehen, and livnehem, where you have a description of a woman and her status vis-a-vis her husband, and her status vis-a-vis the Yavam. Truth be told, this will be explained, or we can say self-explanatory, as we go through the Mishnah. So first the Mishnah lists off 4 categories, and then goes on to explain them where each diamond appears. So the Mishnah, Yesh mutaros lebalei and vasuros livneim. There are situations where the woman is allowed to marry her husband, but she would be forbidden to the Yavam. Let us emphasize a point that we haven't spoken about in a long time, but we spoke about it extensively early in the Masechta. A Yavam is a brother of the deceased where they have a common father. They don't necessarily have a common mother. So that with that in mind, we will be able to envision a situation where a woman is muter to one and not muteres to the other. There are other factors that will come into play, other examples, but that's just one point of information that is helpful to bear in mind. So we have women that are allowed, their marriage to their husbands is okay, is kosher, but in the event that the husband dies leaving no children and she becomes a Yevamos, she would be forbidden to that surviving brother. You can also have a situation mutaros liivmehem vasuros balen, where for her original marriage, the initial marriage to her husband, that was forbidden, but as far as the Yavam is concerned, that would be okay. Mutaros lielu ulielu. There are situations where the woman is muteres to her husband and to the Yavam. We might as well say that would be the standard kosher case, kosher family, no problems. That would be it. She's muteres to her husband. Husband dies leaving no children. The widow would marry his brother. V'asuros lielu ulielu. And there are situations where she's usher to her husband and to the Yavam as well. And now the Mishnah goes and explains, gives examples of each category. V'elu mutaros lebalein v'asuros liivneim. The following are examples of those women that their initial marriage to their husbands was okay, was kosher, but forbidden to the surviving brother, to her brother-in-law. Example: Kohen hedyot shenosa esho almona. A Kohen hedyot who had married a widow. V'yesh loy ach kohen gadol. And this Kohen hedyot has a brother who was a Kohen gadol. Now a Kohen hedyot is allowed to marry an almona. However, a Kohen gadol is not allowed to marry an almona. There's a technical point that is added here by Rashi. Kohen hedyot, the first Rashi, Yesh mutaros Kohen hedyot shenosa esho almona hu hadin lebesula. The same would apply if the Kohen hedyot married a virgin woman, not just an almona. The kishemes, when he dies, when the husband dies, nasis almona, she becomes a widow by definition. Ve'asura l'kohen gadol achiv. And as such, she is not going to be allowed to be married by his brother, the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol is very limited in whom he can marry, and amongst the different excluded women are almonas, are widows. We continue in the Mishnah with a second example. Cholol shenosa kshera v'yesh lo ach kosher. A cholol is a son of a Kohen. The father had married improperly. He had married a divorcee. The son is a cholol. The as such, he is basically stripped of his Kohen entitlements and Kohen identity. He marries a woman who is kshera. Kshera, we'll see, the Gemara deals with this language later. What does it mean she's kshera? But certainly we're talking about a case where the woman is allowed to marry the cholol. She doesn't have restrictions. And v'yesh lo ach kosher. The cholol has a brother whose mother was someone other than the divorcee. They're brothers from a common father, as we said before. And the brother is a Kohen that is kosher. Now, a Kohen that is kosher is not going to be allowed to marry the woman that had intimacy with a cholol. Once she had intimacy with the cholol, she becomes a chalola. And a chalola is an example of a woman that is prohibited to a Kohen. So this was a marriage where the initial marriage was kosher, but as time went on, she became a chalola because of her intimacy with her husband, the cholol, and the brother, who is the yavam, he cannot marry her. So she's also to the yavam. Third example, Yisrael shenosa bas Yisrael. A rank and file regular Jewish fellow married a regular Jewish girl. V'yesh lo ach mamzer, and his brother is an illegitimate fellow. An example of that would be where a man fathered we'll say the Yisrael that's mentioned here, but that father, that man, went ahead and had an adulterous relationship with another woman. So the father is the father of both of them, but that brother is an illegitimate child. He is the product of a forbidden intimacy to the tune of an isur kores. And as a result, the widow, who is a kosher bas Yisrael, she cannot marry a mamzer. A mamzer is forbidden to marry into the Jewish people. Number 4, mamzer shenosa mamzeres. Two illegitimates marry, and that's okay. The Torah accepts that, where two illegitimates marry one another. V'yesh lo ach Yisrael, and the mamzer happens to have a brother that is a legitimate, where the mamzer's father had a regular wife, a kosher marriage, and they produced a son. This ach Yisrael happens to be the yavam in this case. When the mamzer dies, he's the surviving brother, brothers from common father. But the widow, who's a mamzeres, she is not allowed to marry into the rank and file Jewish fold. So all of these are mutaros lebalein, vasuros liyevmehem. On a superficial level, you see this line is repeated, but it could be that after a long list of examples, it's important just to summarize it again. V'elu mutaros liyevmehem vasuros lebalehen. The following are examples of something where there's a heter to the yavam, but not to the original husband. And like we said before, you'll see that this list entails 4 examples, and there will be a summary expression, a repeat expression right before the next diamond. Again, saying mutaros liyevmehem v'asuros liyevalein. So here we're going to have 4 examples where the initial marriage is not acceptable. Kohen Gadol, number 1, Kohen Gadol shekidesh eso almona. The Kohen Gadol offered money to a widow in marriage. He didn't actually cohabit with her. He offered her money, no intimacy yet, and he dies. V'yesh lo ach kohen hedyot. Now what's significant here, we emphasize this, we also underline shekidesh. As a result of giving her money, he doesn't make her into a chalola. A chalola, we mentioned before, is a woman who experiences a forbidden type of intimacy, and in this case there was no forbidden intimacy yet. Our definition was fairly broad. There are more details to it, but she didn't experience the intimacy. So when the Kohen Gadol brother dies, when the initial husband dies, the woman becomes a Yevama, to his brother who is a regular Kohen, she's kosher, she's acceptable to him. Because he's not a Kohen Gadol, he's just a regular Kohen. Kosher shenosa chalola, a Kohen kosher is not allowed to marry a chalola, and that's what happened here. So that's an example of her. She's also leba'ala, she's also to her husband. V'yeshlo a cholol, but his brother is a cholol. A cholol can marry a chalola. He's the yavam. This is the yavam, and they're hence also to the original husband. But the chalola is muteris to the yavam, the cholol. You'll ask, how could that be? So we have a father who, a Kohen, who had a legitimate marriage and a kosher marriage, and that produced the initial husband, the initial son, who was the husband of the chalola. And that same father married a divorcee and produced the brother, the cholol. So the chalola, though, is muteris to the cholol. Yisrael shenosa, number 3, Yisrael shenosa mamzeres. That's a forbidden relationship. A Yisrael is not allowed to marry a mamzeres, an illegitimate woman. V'yesh lo ach mamzer, and he has a brother that's a mamzer. That's okay. So she's kshera, she's acceptable to the yavam. Number 4, mamzer shenosa bas Yisrael, an unacceptable initial marriage. An illegitimate man marries a kosher woman. V'yesh lo ach Yisrael, and the mamzer happens to have a brother that's a kosher fellow. So whereas the father of these two boys, he had one legitimate child, and the mamzer was a product of an illegitimate relationship that he had. All of these cases, the cases we just read, are mutoros livneim ve'asuros lebaleim. They're muter to the yavam, but to the initial husband they were forbidden. V'elu asuros li'elu uli'elu. The following are examples of women that are also to the initial husband and to the yavam as well. Kohen Gadol shenosa esa almona. A Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry an almona, and he did. V'yesh lo ach Kohen Gadol, and he has a brother that is a Kohen Gadol as well. So the two brothers are forbidden to her, the husband and the yavam. Oy Kohen Hedyot kosher shenosa chalola v'yesh lo ach kosher. Once again, you have sandwiched in between the husband and the yavam. You can see with our markings a chalola. Well, the husband was a Kohen kosher and the brother was a Kohen kosher. So she's also to both of them. A third case. Yisrael shenosa mamzeres v'yesh lo ach Yisrael. Again, with the markings, it's pretty easy to see that sandwiched between the two kosher men is a mamzeres. So she's also to her initial husband and also to the yavam as well. Mamzer shenosa bas Yisrael v'yesh lo ach mamzer. Asuros li'elu uli'elu. The mamzer has a brother who's also a mamzer, and one of the brothers married initially a bas Yisrael. That was a forbidden marriage. He dies, leaving a brother that's a mamzer, but the widow is a bas Yisrael. She's not muteris to the mamzer. So these are cases of asuros li'elu uli'elu. Ushar kol hanoshim mutaros l'baleim livneim. In all other cases, the wife is muteris to her husband, and she'll be muteris to the yavam as well. Shnios midivrei sofrim. Oh, it's been a long time since we mentioned the term shnios. Shnios are relatives or relations that are osur midrabanan. They're not banned by the Torah, but they are prohibited midrabanan. Those are shnios. Shnios midivrei sofer means the shnios are relatives that are prohibited, but on a rabbinic level. Shnia labal velo shnia liyavam. You could have a situation where she is a shnia to the husband, but not to the yavam. Asura labal umuteres liyavam. An example of shnia labal velo shnia liyavam you find in Rashi. Ein imoy shel baal. A man's mother's mother, a grandmother, she is prohibited on a rabbinic level. So she's the initial husband's grandmother, velo shel yavam, but it's not the It's not his brother's grandmother. This would be a situation where these are two brothers that have a common father, but they don't have a common mother. So Mr. 1's grandmother is not Mr. 2's maternal grandmother. We continue. That having been a case of a shniya l'baal lo shniya l'yavam, we saw was also prohibited to the husband. It's his grandmother, but it's not the yavam's grandmother. And flip that case around. Shniya l'yavam v'lo shniya l'baal. The woman is a shniya to the yavam. She's the yavam's mother's mother, but not the initial husband's. Asura l'yavam umuteres l'baal. So we rule that she's also to her grandson, but she's muteres to the husband. Shniya lozeh ulozeh. Asura lozeh ulozeh. If she is, in using the case we had before, you have two brothers that come from the same mother and father, and they were talking about the mother's mother. This woman mothered the two sons. So her mother is a shniya to both the husband and to the yavam. Ein law lo ksuba v'lo peros v'lo mazonos v'lo blos v'avlad kosher v'kaifen oisei lahoitzi. Where you have a couple that are forbidden to one another midurabanan on a rabbinic level, in this category known as shnios, so the Mishnah says that if the woman is also to both the husband and the yavam, she loses her ksuba rights. The Mishnah listed a number of points that are ksuba oriented. Ksuba is the marriage guarantee that a woman receives, a financial guarantee that if she should be divorced or becomes a widow, she would be entitled to funds. And there are other points here that Rashi goes through, but we'll get to that in a little while. Just that we want to emphasize now is that if the woman is a shniya to the husband and the yavam, so she loses all of these rights. However, a child that is born from this union is kosher, as the Mishnah says, vavlad kosher, and we also insist that they split, they part ways, hence koifenoi silahotzi. This is in contrast to that which follows, where the Mishnah says, Almana l'kohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedyot, a kohen gadol who marries a widow, a regular kohen that marries a divorcee, or a chalutza, mamzer sunasinu l'Yisrael, a mamzer that marries a Yisrael, or a nosin that marries Yisrael, bas Yisrael l'nosin u'lamamzer. So that if you have both of either side of the equation, the husband is a mamzer and the wife is kosher, or the wife is a mamzer and the husband is kosher, in those cases, yesh lohen ksuba, there is a ksuba that the woman would receive. The Mishnah mentioned a number of points. Rashi takes time to explain each one of these points. We can look at the Rashi together. Truth be told, that these are discussed at greater length in Maseches Ksubas, but nevertheless the points are made here. So we take a look at the Rashi. Velo peros. We're looking at Rashi in the narrow lines, a few lines before they become wide. Velo peros ein mishalem lo peros nichse mulug she'ochal mishalah. In the event that the husband wife shniya relationship comes to an end, where he divorces her, so she does not receive the value of the fruits that he, the husband, had consumed and benefited from properties that she had brought into the marriage, the nichse melug. Those are properties that a woman brings into the marriage, that the principal remains that of the wife, and the husband, generally speaking, is entitled to the use of the fruit. And in this case, he uses the fruit and does not compensate her for the fruit that he benefited from. Even though this right that a husband has to use the fruits of the properties that she brings into the marriage, is a takona, is a rabbinic entitlement that the husband has in exchange for his redeeming her from captivity. If his wife is taken into captivity, so the husband is expected to redeem her. That's the word pirkona, Rashi just said. Now, that even though the peros, the usufruct that the husband is entitled to is in exchange for his redeeming her, and here we don't have that. Rashi goes on, Kidisnan, lo kosav law, di'im tishtaboy afrikinoch, even if a man does not write into this marriage document, this marriage contract, if he doesn't write into it this clause that if you are taken into captivity, tishtaboy means being taken to captivity, afrikinoch, I will redeem you, that doesn't matter whether he wrote it in or not. Chayov livdosa shutnai bezdin. He is obligated to redeem her because this is a court expectation, a court condition when there is a marriage. V'zu ein chayav livdoisa. However, if you have a shnia, a marriage where the couple are actually forbidden to one another on the grounds of there being a prohibition of shnios to one another, he is not obligated to redeem her. The lo karinan babe, because part of that redemption clause reads as follows: "Va'osvinoch li'intu," and I will redeem you from captivity. Osvinoch li'intu means I will take you back as my wife. If it's a forbidden relationship, he is in fact not to take her back as a wife. We don't want them to be together. So, in terms of redemption, the husband that's a shnia to his wife is not going to be redeeming her. So if he's not going to be redeeming her, so he shouldn't be entitled to the usufruct. Nevertheless, afilu hachi lo yishalim lo peros shocha mishala. Even though he's not going to be redeeming her if she's taken into captivity, nevertheless, he is not going to compensate her for the fruits that he benefited from her properties. Kin before Gemara Tanai ksuba kiksuba domi. As the Gemara explains later, the conditions of a ksuba, we'll say the aspects or facets of a ksuba, are like the ksuba itself. The ksuba itself is the basic payment that a husband will pay to his wife in the event he divorces her, or she would receive from his estate if she becomes a widow, known often as 200 zuz. That's the basic ksuba. There are other facets that make up the ksuba, and we touched on one of them, the peros. And the rule is that these additional facets of a ksuba, the tanai ksuba, are like the ksuba itself. The konsura bona de lo gavia mine ksubas nichse tzon barzo shechnis lo mishala b'toras ksuba, just like in the case of a shnia relationship, she will not be able to collect from him the value of the tzon barzel properties that she brought into the marriage, that he had guaranteed their value to her. Those are nichsei tzon barzel. In this shnia relationship, she will not gain compensation for those properties. Konsuanami de lo tigva mine peros she'ochal b'tanai ksuba shel pirkona shu tanai besdin she'ein kosuv b'shtar ksuba. Likewise, she will not receive compensation for the value of the nichsei tzon barzel, the properties that she brought into the marriage that ordinarily are written into the ksuba and their value is written in, and he guarantees that value to her. We say in the shnia type marriage, she loses that. She loses those aspects of the ksuba that are also not written into the ksuba necessarily. For example, the guarantee to be redeemed. So which is a tanai ksuba, she loses that as well. So far we have pointed out what is meant by the woman not receiving peros. She doesn't receive compensation for the fruits of the properties that her husband benefited from those properties that she brought into the marriage. Rashi goes on, velo mezonos. She doesn't get mezonos, food or maintenance
rights either. Lo mibaya. Rashi goes on to say, Lo mibaya hecha diyasva to say. It goes not. We don't have to tell you that where she's living with him, they're together. The lo kaifinon lay, that we will not intervene and force him to support her. Daha ba'omud the hotzei koi. That's an expression, means get up and leave. We want to disband this marriage, so we don't want to have provisions that encourage it to remain together. So we don't want her to receive support from him. Elo afilu im holach lemedinas hayam, even if the husband goes abroad, v'lovsa v'ochla lo meshalim, and the husband went abroad and she went and borrowed money to buy food, that husband does not have to pay back the loan. Rashi continues by raising a question, but we're not going to get involved with that particular question, but skip to the next Rashi. Velo blois. Blows means worn out clothing. Imadayin yesh lo blos ushchokim min begonim shifnisa lo. If a woman brought into the marriage men's clothing, she brought into the marriage some suits, and the husband wore the suits and they got worn out. Eino noitloson kishiyotza. She does not take those worn suits back when she leaves this marriage. The konsur rabbanon. The rabbanon imposed a fine, a loss on her. Now we turn back to our Gemara text after having contrasted the shnios midivrei sofrim, those relatives that are prohibited on a rabbinic level. If they marry one another, so she will lose all of these ksuba rights. A prohibited relationship like an almona l'kohen gadol or grusha l'chutz l'kohen hedyot, which happen to be Torah level prohibitions, there, interestingly, she does receive her ksuba. The Gemara will deal with this difference. Before we continue further into the Gemara itself, we glance at the side. We have a nosei mivneh heading, a topic heading with a structural note, and we also note that this discussion will continue till Amid Beis. The house marking highlights the expression my irya, which involves as we've written in our note, birur lashon HaMishnah, will be clarifying the expressions found in the Mishnah, some words, terms found in the Mishnah. We want to understand what their significance is. After we begin the first question, you'll notice a series of triangles. They introduce nisyonos lahashiv al hasheila rishon, attempts to answer the first question. So, without any further ado, we continue in the Gemara. My irya detani nasa. In the beginning of the Mishnah, the first example that we had, and we have an arrow to the side as well, it said in the Mishnah, Kohen Hedyot Shenasa Es Ha'almona. We were trying to describe there a case of kosher initial marriage and forbidden to the Yavam. The Mishnah cited an example of the Kohen Hedyot that consummated his marriage with a widow. So the Gemara is asking, why do you have to speak about a consummated marriage? My area detoni nosa lisni kidesh. Imagine the Mishnah would have presented a case of a Kohen Hedyot, a common Kohen, who had offered money to an almona in marriage. So if he was mekadesh an almona and he has a brother that's a Kohen Gadol, would that not also be a prohibited marriage to the Yavam? Oh, fine. As far as the common Kohen is concerned, that's an acceptable marriage. But as far as the marriage to the Kohen Gadol, she is now an almona. With the death of the husband of the Kohen Hedyot, she's an almona. So why does the Mishnah insist on nosa when it could have said Kohen Hedyot shekidesh, where they only entered the first stage of the marriage process, kiddushin, where the husband Kohen Hedyot dies, she's an almona minha erisin. She's an almona as well. V'chitema, the Gemara goes on to ask, or to suggest as an answer, V'chitema, Taima denosa dehava lei haseh v'lo saseh. The reason that there's a prohibition to the Yavam, who is a Kohen Gadol, is because now, with the consummation of the marriage on the part of his brother, the Kohen Hedyot, she becomes forbidden to the Yavam, the Kohen Gadol, on two counts. There's an Aseh and a Lo Saseh. The Lo Saseh, she is prohibited to a Kohen Gadol as an Almona. It's a negative command that a Kohen Gadol shall not take an Almona. And as an Aseh in the Torah, a positive command that a Kohen Gadol is to marry a virgin woman. So once the Kohen Hedyot initial marriage had been consummated, the wife becomes also to the brother-in-law on two grounds. An Aseh, she's not a Basula anymore, she's not a virgin, and also she is an Almona, that's a Lo Saseh. And when you have two we'll say mitzvahs, two violations, that will prevent the yibum from taking place. The yibum is a mitzvah saseh, a positive command, and we would say that a positive command of yibum is not strong enough to overrule a positive and negative. Avol, kidesh, however, if the Kohen Hedyot had only been mekadesh her, and then she becomes an almona, she is prohibited, her virginity remains, she's still a basula. So one would say that maybe yibum can take place. Avol kidesh osi aseh, we would say the positive command of yibum would come along, v'dochi losas, and overrule the negative command, the negative mitzvah of almona. So is that what was that what you would want to explain why the Mishnah had to use the example of Nasa, where there was marriage consummation, where the husband and wife not only had Erusin, had Kedushin, but also cohabited, had intimacy with one another? Because otherwise the Mishnah wouldn't have been able to describe this as Osir Li of man, because Yibum would have overruled her status of being a mere almana without losing her besula. Well, that's not a legitimate answer. The Hakula Pirkin, the entire parak, features examples of Aseh velo sasehu. You have on the one hand Yibum, on the other hand there is an Isur, the Aseh of Yibum, and you have the negative of whatever Isur is involved. For example, you have a kosher marriage, and then the brother is a mamzer. And when the kosher marriage, when the husband dies, so there is now a yibum situation, but there's a lo saseh of not marrying a mamzer. And we see in all of these examples, and we just cited one of them, we don't say that their yibum takes place. We don't say that the aseh of yibum comes and overpowers the lo saseh in any of the other cases. So, once again, why does the Mishnah insist on using the example of Kohen Hedyot she nosa es almana when it could have used the example of Kohen Hedyot she kidesh es almana? So the Gemara answers. Number one, Mishum de Kaboi Lemisni Seifa. The Mishnah had an agenda, and it wanted to teach in the latter part of the Mishnah, Kohen Gadol Shenosa Es Almana. We have a little star if you want to find this by looking up above in the Mishnah. There was the Mishnah cited an example of a woman who's also to the husband and the yavam. And it used as an example, Kohen Gadol Shenosa Almana. And in that case, we say Dafka Nasa there only because he had consummated the marriage. The Shavi Chalola. But we should actually mention the case earlier in the Mishnah than that. But in the Sefer there was a case of Kohen Gadol Shekidesh Shesamon, and he had an Ach Kohen Hedyot. Let us just correct ourselves. Where we had mentioned above in the Mishnah the star facing the line of Kohen Gadol She Nosas Almona, Rashi points out that we're describing that case as an example of the husband and the Yavam as being usher, not only if he had an ach Kohen Gadol, but even if that Kohen Gadol had an ach of being a Kohen Hedyot. We're now emphasizing, as a result of the Kohen Gadol's initial marriage being consummated with the Almona, she would become usher to his brother, even though it's not stated explicitly, but she would be usher to his brother if he were a Kohen Hedyot. On second thought, by reading the Mishnah a little more carefully than we did, when you look at the third wide line of the Mishnah, it described the Kohen Gadol that was Nos Almona, and he has a brother that's a Kohen Gadol, or Kohen Hedyot. So in the Seifah, the Mishnah wanted to feature how you have an Isser to the Yavam as well, and the example cited was a Kohen Hedyot. How does she become usher to the Kohen Hedyot? Only because the Kohen Gadol was Nosa the Almona. By that action of consummating the marriage, she becomes a Chalola, and as a result she becomes usher to the Kohen Hedyot. So as a result of that example in the Seifah, where it had to teach Nosa, in order for us to see how she is usher to the Kohen Hedyot brother, therefore, in the Reisha, the opening of the Mishnah, it also, as the Gemara says, Tana Nami Reisha Nasa. So the Reisha also, which was our question, why did it teach Nasa in the opening example? Hence we have an answer. Just to repeat that, in the Reisha we saw Kohen Hedyot Shenosas Almona, and he has an Ach Kohen Gadol. We asked, even without Nasa, the Ach Kohen Gadol, the Yavam, would be Aser, even if the Kohen Hedyot was only Mekadisher in the beginning of the Mishnah. So why did the Mishnah use the term Nasa, the Kohen Hedyot Shenosas Almona? So the Gemara is answering at this point because of that which we see in the Seifah, the example taught on the third wide line, where only because of Nasa do we see that the woman is usher to the Yavam Kohen Hedyot as well. The Gemara asks, the Adatoni Mishum Seifah, instead of choosing Nasa because of the Seifah, Lisni Mishum Mitziasa. Why doesn't the Mishnah use the term Kidesh in anticipation of an earlier part of the Mishnah, where you see, and again, here use the double star, you can see above in the Mishnah, Kohen Gadol, Shekidesh es ho almona v'yesh lo ach Kohen Hedyot. In the middle section of the Mishnah, where the Mishnah was describing a woman mutter to the Yavam and also to the husband, a case where a Kohen Gadol was Mekadesh and Almana, that was forbidden for him to do, but she, and then he dies, leaving her just an Almana, because the marriage wasn't consummated, so she's mutter to the Yavam. And in that section of the Mishnah, Kidesh was used. So why in the Reisha didn't the Mishnah use Kidesh? If your attempted answer was to suggest only because something Nasa was used in the beginning of the Mishnah because of Nasa appearing later in the Seifah of the Mishnah, you could have in the opening of the Mishnah used the word Kidesh in anticipation of the middle section of the Mishnah where Kidesh was featured. So we have to come up with a new answer why Nasa was cited in the opening example of the Mishnah. Ela mishum bas buksa. Rather, because of something that's together with it. Bas buksa means something next to it. The example number 1 of the Mishnah that we saw on the 5th line of the Mishnah, and we saw Nasa featured there, is because it wanted to teach next to it Mishum dekaboi lemisni cholol shenosok shera. That was the very next example in the Mishnah. We have a squiggle-lined arrow pointing to that line above in the Mishnah, where Nasa appeared. And what was the case? A cholol, a fellow whose father was a Kohen, married a divorcee and had this son who we call a cholol. We call a child stripped of Kohen rights, who married a kshera, a woman who was an acceptable type woman, a woman who could have married a Kohen. The Mishnah says that marriage was kosher with the initial husband. The brother, who is a Kohen kosher, will not be able to marry. She's usher to the Yavam. How does she become usher to the Yavam? The Gemara goes on, Taimo de Nasa. The reason that she's usher to the Yavam is because the Cholol had consummated the marriage with her, making her into a Chalola. So it's because the Cholol had been nosei. Why is she also to the Avam? She's also to the Avam, who otherwise is a kosher person, is because the Cholol was nosei, consummated the marriage with her, the Shavya Chalola, making her into a Chalola. Avol Kidesh, had the initial husband was a cholol, simply been mekadesher, offered her money in marriage but didn't consummate their marriage, sharya lei, she would have been allowed to marry the yavam who was kosher, a kohen hedyot that was kosher. Mishum hachi kotani nasa. Therefore, in example 1 of the Mishnah, nasa was used. So instead of trying to, let's say, legitimatize nasa by fishing far away from shore, going somewhere deep into the Mishnah, the Gemara's final answer then is simply because of that which is right next to it in the Mishnah. The word nasa was used in the first example. Umay Irya, the Gemara goes on with another question. Umay Irya the Kotani Almona. The Mishnah spoke about a Kohen Hedyot that married an Almona. Lisni Besula. In that very first case, it could have, if you want to illustrate, mutter to the husband and also to the Yavam, it could have given a case of a Kohen Hedyot that married a Besula. When he dies, when the Kohen Hedyot dies, so she becomes a widow and is usher on those grounds to his brother, the Kohen Gadol, who's not allowed to marry a widow. So what was the Mishnah's interest in teaching in that first example a case of the Kohen Hedyot marrying an Almona? It could have taught a case of his marrying a Basula. V'chitema, the Gemara continues at the top of Amud Beis. V'chitema kosavar haitana. You might want to answer that the Tana is of the opinion nisuin harishonim mapilin, that the heter or the status of the woman to the yavam is decided or is determined by what was the identity, or what was the status of the initial marriage. So, if you want to illustrate her being prohibited to the Yavam, there would have had to be a problem with her to the Yavam at the initial marriage to her husband. And if the initial marriage was between a Kohen Hedyot and a Basula, well, a Basula is okay for a Kohen Gadol. So if you want to say that the choice of Almona was because of this concept of Nisuin Harishonim Apilin, well, that isn't going to be a sufficient explanation. Harei Cholol Shenosok Kshera, a Cholol that married a Kshera, a woman that's Kshera, and we say that's also for the Yavam. She is also to the Ach Kosher, the Kohen Hedyot, regular Kohen, brother of the Cholol. At the initial point of marriage, what was her status? She was Kshera. V'lo amrinon nisuon harishonim apilin. We don't say there that she can marry the Yavam based on the fact that she was Kshera at the beginning. So the Gemara has to explain why did the Mishnah open up with an example of a Kohen Hedyot marrying an Almona. The Mishnah could have used an example of a Kohen Hedyot marrying a Besula. She still would have been ushered to the Yavam. So the Gemara answers, Ha Vadai, this example, the use of the term Almona in the beginning of the Mishnah, that is Vadai Mishum Seifa. That's definitely because the Mishnah was taking into consideration the latter part of the Mishnah. Mishum de Kaboy Lemisna Seifa, because the Mishnah wanted to teach later on. Kohen Gadol Shenoso Es Almona V'yesh Lo Ach Kohen Gadol Ol Kohen Hedyot. At that point in the Mishnah, where it was teaching a woman who was also to the husband and to the surviving brother and to the Yavam, there Dafka Almona, the Mishnah there had to teach a case of Almona. Avo Besula, had she been a Besula there, Chazia lay, she would have been fit for the Yavam. She would have been fit for the initial marriage if we're talking there about a Kohen Gadol that married a Besula, so it wouldn't have helped to illustrate that which the Mishnah was trying to show at that point. There, the Mishnah was trying to demonstrate a case of a woman also to the husband and also to the Yavam. If the Kohen Gadol was marrying a Besula, not only would she be mutter to the husband, she would have been mutter to the brother Kohen Hedyot as well. So therefore, at that point in the Mishnah, it had to use the example of Almona. Mishum hachi kotani Almona. Therefore, in the Reisha, also, the example Almona was used. But once again, let's repeat the main point. Not because in the Reisha it had to give the example of Almona. It could have used the example of Besula as well, but in consideration of the Seifa, where Almona had to be the cited example, the Reisha used a similar case, and a case of an Almona. Now, the Gemara has a question. You'll notice that it's a long question, and on the side of the Gemara, we introduce this with a topic heading. They say, Lama lo muva b'Mishnah. Why is the following not cited in the Mishnah? Hadugma shel mitzri sheni shenosa shnei mitzrios achas rishona v'achas shniya v'chulei. Our Mishnah had an agenda. It wanted to show cases where a woman is usher to her husband, mutter to the Yavam, vice versa, or two where both are usher to the woman, or both are mutter to the husband. The Mishnah cited a number of different situations. The following could have been included as part of the examples of the Mishnah, and it involves a second generation Mitzri convert. That means there was an Egyptian that converted, and he married, as he is quite limited in whom he can marry, he married also an Egyptian convert, and they produce children. And we'll see the different examples as the Gemara itself unfolds. But using that model, we could have presented another set of examples as the Mishnah itself described, of Osir Libal Mutter Liyavam, Mutter Libal Osir Liyavam, etc. All of this is contained in this long question. So now the Gemara. Maskif lo Rav Papa. Im Isa lahadchi Osir Rav Dimi Rav Yochanan. If Rav Dimi's teaching is to be accepted, and what does Rav Dimi's teaching say? Mitzri Sheni Shenosa Mitzris Rishoina, a second generation Egyptian convert that marries a first generation woman Egyptian that converted to Judaism. Beno Sheni Have, the son, the child, takes on the status of a second generation, because we follow the mother. Vis-a-vis the mother was a first generation Egyptian convert. Her son would be called a second generation. So if we accept Rav Dimi's rule, listening nami, then let the Mishnah teach the following. And what we have here, we have a long marking that we indicate Nisni Nami. All of this is what the Mishnah could have included within its boundaries. The following: Mitzri Sheni Shenosa Shtei Mitzrios. Imagine a second generation Mitzri that marries two kinds of Egyptian women. Achas Rishona v'Achas Shniya. So he has two wives. One of them is a first generation Egyptian convert, and the other wife is the daughter of Egyptians that converted. She's a Shniya, a second generation Mitzri Shniya. V'hoyu lo bonim merishono mishniya. And he has sons. So you have brothers here. They're brothers. They have the same father, but their identities, the sons' identities are different. What are the sons? So since the father had married a Rishona Shniya, the sons are going to be a Sheni and a Shlishi respectively. So you have two brothers, one is a Mitzri Sheni and the other is a Mitzri Shlishi. A Mitzri Shlishi, one should bear in mind, is considered a regular Jew, and his marriage options include Jewish women from pure Jewish background. I nosiv ki urchayu. If the two brothers, we label them as a Sheni and Shlishi, if they would marry women that are just like them. So now you would have a situation where Mutoros Libalehen, Mitzri Sheni is entitled to marry a Mitzri Shniya. A Mitzri Shlishi man is entitled to marry a Mitzri Shlishi. In other words, they are of similar identity. So they're Mutoros Libalehen. We should point out, by the way, when we speak about a Mitzri Shlishi, he marries a Yisraelis. That would be Kiur Chayo. They marry in their normal way. A Sheni married a Shniya, and the Shlishi married a Yisraelis. Well, they're Mutoros Lebalein, they're mutter to their husbands. V'asuros liyav mehem. In the case that those husbands would die, so if let us say the Mitzri Sheni husband who had married a Shniya would die, she's falling to Yibum to a brother that's a Shlishi, but a Shlishi is not allowed to marry a Shniya. And likewise, if the Shlishi died, leaving the wife Yisraelis, she's not allowed to marry a Mitzri Sheni. So here we have an example of Mutoros Libale and Asuros Livman. The Epuch V'Nasuv, if the Mitzri Sheni married a Yisraelis and the Mitzri Shlishi married a Shniya, so there we're describing a case that would be as follows: Mutoros Livmehem, V'Asuros Libalein. The initial marriage there is forbidden. So if we spell out the case, just to cite one example, we said a Mitzri Sheni married a Yisraelis. He has a brother that's a Shlishi. So the initial marriage was the Sheni with the Yisraelis. However, when the Sheni dies and the Yisraelis falls to a Mitzri Shlishi, that's mutter. She's mutter to the Yavam. Now, using the same family of a Sheni and a Shlishi, brothers that one's a Mitzri Sheni, one's a Mitzri Shlishi, Mutoros li'elu li'elu, an example of a marriage there that the woman would be mutter to the husband and to the Yavam, Kioros. If they had married as a regular type of convert. Rashi explains, Kiores, Muteres, a Gioris is Muteres L'Shlishi D'Yisraelo. She's mutter to the Mitzri Shlishi, who as said, is defined as a regular Yisrael. And L'Sheni, she is mutter also to a Mitzri Sheni, de Kahal Gerim Lo Ikri Kahal. V'lo Ikri, V'lo Karinon, Shlishi Yavo B'Kahal, V'lo Sheni. Dezu Lav Kahal Havoi. Now we know that a Mitzri is Lo Yavo B'Kal Hashem.
but the sheni and the sheni is not called a kahal. Let us repeat ourselves. The giores, let us correct ourselves by saying the giores is not called a kahal. The sheni is restricted in marrying those people that are categorized as kahal, regular Jews. But the community of gerim are not categorized by the term kahal. This is a point we've mentioned extensively in the past. So since the mitzri sheni is not categorized, since the ger is not categorized as kahal, and the restriction is only for a mitzri sheni to enter kahal, the mitzri sheni marriage to the giores is okay. Let's go back to the Gemara. Asuros lielu ulielu. An example of someone that would be usur to both would be Ailonios. And here again we look at Rashi. Asuros lielu elu. Ailinus Yisraelis. An ailinus is a woman who hasn't matured normally, so she's incapable of procreation, and she has other, we'll say, unusual characteristics, as we saw in our recent Gemaras. An ailinus Yisraelis. So she is forbidden to both of the brothers. As Rashi, we have two brothers, Mitzri Sheni and a Shlishi. Rashi goes on, Im Sheni nosa Yisraelis vi ailinus. If the Mitzri Sheni married the ailinus, well, asuralo, she's also to him mishum the Yisraelis he. She is an Yisrael. She's considered a regular Jewess, and as such, she's not allowed to marry. She is kahal. She's not, and a Mitzri Sheni is not allowed to marry into kahal. Ukshemes, and when the Mitzri Sheni dies, asur Yevama, she's also to the Yavam, who is a Shlishi mishum asher teleid. The expectation of Yibum is that the widow will produce a child to continue the name of her deceased husband, but she's not asher teleid. Pratlailin is Sheni Oletus. She's incapable of procreation. So, as such, she would be also to the Yavam as well. So here we've come to the end of our question. The Mishnah could have included the case of a Mitzri Sheni that married two Mitzrios, and we could have then presented all of these examples, and they would be fine illustrations of what the Mishnah was trying to teach. The Gemara answers, and we have a new marking scheme, triangles that are used. On the side of the Gemara, we have under our nosei mivneh heading, this is a ma'akav, an attempt to keep track. Truth is, it's just simply a continuation of the nosei, so it's more accurate for us simply calls this the mivneh, that we have a triangle with the point facing up represents a tshuva, an answer to this long question, and the answer will be Tana Vashir. The Tana taught the examples that it taught, and it left this out. Hasiba shelo kotani hadugma shel mitzri sheni, who the reason the Mishnah didn't use this example, mishum de Tana, it taught what it taught, Vashir, and it left this example out. Uma od shir, in order to give this kind of answer that the Tana was abbreviated, namely, it taught something and left out something else. Something in addition, not just one example, but something else would have had to been left out. Uma od shir. So what else was left out? Shir hadugma shel ptsua daka. The Gemara will answer that it left out an example involving a ptsua daka. Ptsua daka is a man that experienced a type of injury which renders him impotent, and he is not allowed to marry into the rank and file Jewish people either. How ptsua daka will illustrate the four different categories, that information is found in the Rashi. But what are we answering? We're answering that, as far as the suggestion is concerned, why didn't the Mishnah include the Mitzri Sheni that married the two Mitzrios?
In fact, it could have cited that example, but the Mishnah didn't cite all examples. It left that out, and it left another example out as well, which is legitimate. It's legitimate for Mishnayos to be abbreviated and not cite all possible examples of what it wants to say. The Gemara, then, we will see an inverted triangle, which represents a question, a kushya. And the question is, Ha'im ve'emes psua daka, is that really a shiur? Is it really absented from the Mishnah? Now, if you skim ahead in the Gemara and follow the triangles and the back and forth movement of them, you will notice that the last triangle is a triangle with the point facing up. In this sugya, that represents an answer. So we will left off with this will be a good answer at the end of the day. So now we turn back to the Gemara. The Gemara had asked, why wasn't the Mitzri case included? The Gemara answers, Tana v'shir. It taught what it taught, and it left out the case of the Mitzri Sheni. We underline Tana v'shir because we want you to focus on this as being the answer, in fact the final answer, but we have to substantiate this answer. My shear the high shear. The inevitable question when this kind of answer is given is, well, what else was left out that you left this out, that you left out the case of the Mitzri Sheni? Answer, shear ptsua daka. It left out the scenario formed by ptsua daka. And here we'll look at the Rashi together. Shear ptsua daka, just right across from here in the Rashi, a line down, you see, it left out ptsua daka, dahava motzi lemisni, Bei kulhu kemokain. It could have taught all of these examples as well, all four categories featuring the ptsua daka. Number one, ptsua daka shenosa Yisraelis, a ptsua daka that marries a regular Jewish woman. Asur labayla umuteres Yevamos kosher. She's also to the ptsua daka. But he has a brother that's normal, that's kosher. So this wife, the Israelis, is mutter to the brother. So that's osir labayla mutter liyavam. Number two, va'kosher shenasa kshera v'yesh lo ach ptsua daka. If a regular healthy fellow married a regular woman, and he has as his brother the ptsua daka, when he dies, when the husband dies, asur liyavama umuter samash, but she had been mutter to her husband. A third case, a third example involving ptsua daka. Ptsua daka shenos Yisraelis v'yesh lo ach ptsua daka. If two brothers that are both ptsua dakas, and one of them in his initial marriage he married a regular kosher woman, so she's also to both of them asur labaylo liyavam. And number four, kiyores muteres lozeh velozeh. If you have a ptsua daka, two brothers that are ptsua dakas, and the one brother married a convert. A convert, once again, as we said earlier, a convert is not categorized as kahal. The Torah speaks about the ptsua dakas being usher to marry kahal Hashem. He's not allowed to marry those people that are under the umbrella term of kahal. But Gerim are not under that, they're not included in the term kahal. So a ptsua daka is allowed to marry a giores, and the brother who's also a ptsua daka yavam can marry her in yibum as well. So that you have muteres lozeh velozeh. The Gemara continues. Question. The inverted triangle in this sugya represents a question. Mishum ptsua daka lav shiura. If ptsua daka is the basis of your explaining why Mitzri Sheni was not included, you can forget about it. It's not considered a deletion, a something that was left out. Deha, Tana, Lei, Chayve, Lavin. Very simply, because the Mishnah in fact stated ptsua daka in a veiled form by citing other examples of negative commands. This, by the way, we have to point out in stark contrast to the Mitzri case. The prohibition of marrying a Mitzri convert is a positive command, where the Torah says you have to wait to the third generation in order to marry the Mitzri. But as far as psuadaka lo yavo b'kal Hashem is a negative command, and the Mishnah already gives examples of lavim like mamzer, cholol, and other cases of negative commands cited in Mishnah. Therefore, the Mishnah had no reason for mentioning psuadaka because it's already considered stated in the Mishnah. The Gemara answers that doesn't revive the question. Rather, otu chayve lavin mi lo kotoni v'hodar tani. True, the Mishnah mentions chayve lavin, but in citing chayve lavin, it states some and it states others too. It states an example of a chiv lav. It talks about the Mishnah talks about a chalola. It talks about mamzerus as well. Let's read that line again. Milo kotoni v'hodartoni. V'hakotoni, does the Mishnah not cite an example of a lav? Koyin hedyot shenoso almona and v'cholol shenoso kshera. Those cases involve negative commands, and it cites two examples of that. So you see the Mishnah doesn't hesitate to repeat examples of negative commands. Why didn't it mention psuadaka, which is also a negative command? So it shows you that the Mishnah is tana v'shir. It teaches some things and leaves out others. And the leaving out isn't because they're an exception to the rule, but rather because the Mishnah is simply not exhaustive in all its examples. So the tana v'shir example is a good answer. The Gemara says no. If you want to prove your point that the Mishnah, after citing one example of a lav, it doesn't hesitate to cite a second example, simply because it gives multiple examples of the same thing. That's not true. In what you just said, that which we numbered 1 and 2 just before this, hahu itzterichole lashminen. The example number 2 of cholol shenosa kshera, that's not there simply as just a random additional example, but that had to be taught. Based Kid Rav Yehuda Omar Rav, it had to be taught to illustrate Rav Yehuda Omar Rav's principle. The Omar Rav Yehuda Omar Rav lo huzaru ksheros linosa psulim. A woman who is called kshera, she is allowed to marry a cholol. And the Mishnah wanted to show an example of a cholol shenosa kshera, of a woman who's mutter to her husband, even though he's a cholol and she's a kshera. That's a heter marriage. Now that example had to be taught in order to make this point. What about the cholol? What about the case of psuadaka? Well, psuadaka didn't have to be taught because the Mishnah already taught another example of a lav. Namely, we saw the case of the kayin hedyot shenoso almona, and if the brother was a kohen gadol, so she would be also belav to the brother, the kohen gadol. So at this point, we have revived the question. Psuadaka is in fact not stated because it was already included in the lav example cited. Hence, it is not an example of tana v'shir. The Gemara says, no, that is not an objection, because I can still show you how the Mishnah is tana v'shir, v'ha katani, cholol shenosa kshera, v'Yisrael shenosa bas Yisrael v'yeshlo ach mamzer. This case of Yisrael shenosa bas Yisrael, and there's an ach mamzer, there you have an example of a lav, and a negative command. So that even though it already taught a case of involving a negative command, it taught an additional case of a negative command. And the absence of psuadaka is simply because of tana v'shir. The Tana teaches some examples and left out others. And if that is so the Mitzri issue also is of no concern, so it doesn't bother us because of tana v'shir. Question: Ha'nami lo mahader misnahi. this example is not an example of simply something that is taught again. The Ashmeinen, the Mishnah, by teaching this additional example of a lav, the Mishnah is doing the following. It's the Ashmeinen lav she'ein shava bakol, v'komash malon lav hashava bakol. The Mishnah gives us different examples of lavim, namely a lav she'ein shava bakol. That's the case of cholol shenasa kshera. That's a Kohen related topic. And then that's a lav she'ein shava bakol. It's a negative command that has relevance only to the realm of kohanim. It's not shava bakol. Only kohanim are bound by that negative command of a halola. And it also teaches me an example of a lav hashava bakol, the case involving mamzerus. That's a negative command applicable to all. But as far as psuadaka is concerned, it wasn't stated in the Mishnah. Why wasn't it stated in the Mishnah? Because the Mishnah already gave us an example of lavim, of negative commands. So that you can't say regarding the psuadaka that tana v'shir. The Gemara says that's no objection. That doesn't revive the question. Ha-katani Yisrael shenosa mamzeres V'yesh lo ach Yisrael. That's an additional example of a lav hashava bakol that is taught in addition to the case of Yisrael shenosa bas Yisrael v'yesh lo ach mamzer. So we see that the Tana cites extra examples, even though it didn't have any chidush in stating this additional example of Yisrael shenosa mamzeres v'yesh lo ach Yisrael. So this is a case of an extra lav that was taught, and as a result, we see the Mishnah doesn't hesitate to, we'll say, to overkill, to teach extra things. As far as psuadaka is concerned, it could have taught that also, but it's sheer, tana v'shir. And so just like we said that psuadaka was left out, it leaves out the case of the mitzri sheni as well. Elo lav shma mino tana v'shir shma mino. So we see from this exhaustive discussion that the Mishnah in fact teaches, it doesn't hesitate to teach extra cases, but it doesn't teach all the examples. So just like it didn't teach the case of psuadaka, it also did not teach the case of the mitzri sheni. Gufa. And now the Gemara focuses back on a point that was mentioned before in passing. And on the side of the Gemara we have as our topic heading, Lo huzaru ksheros linosei lupsulim. The women that are ksheros are not warned against marrying men that are considered disqualified. Now, what that refers to, we've already alluded to it. It's not a reference across the boards to all kosher women marrying all men that are disqualified, but it's much more specific to the realm of kaihanim, kaihanois, and chalolim, etc. We'll see as we go through the Gemara how the Gemara nails this point. Gufa. Omar of Yehuda Amarav. This was mentioned before. Lo huzaru ksheros linosei lepsulim. Ksheros are not warned by the Torah, not prohibited by the Torah for marrying psulim. Leimo meseale. Can we cite our Mishnah as a support to this Amoraic teaching? What did our Mishnah say? Cholol shenosa kshera. The Mishnah, you may recall, featured this under the examples of a woman who's mutter to her husband and eventually also to the Yavam, but we want to focus right now on Cholol shenosa kshera as an example of mutter to her husband. my lav, when it says that the cholol married a ksheira, my lav, kohenes, horauya lo, the kohenes, that means the daughter of a kohen, she is fit to a cholol. Umay ksheira, and what does ksheira in the Mishnah mean? Ksheira, the kahuna, a woman who is otherwise kosher to marry into the kahuna. So this would be a support to what Rav Yehuda Marav was saying, that women who are ksheros l'kahuna can marry psulim, people that are disqualified from the kahuna. Loi, that's not what the Mishnah meant. Rather, when it said cholol shenosek shera, it meant Yisraelis, a regular Jewish girl. Umay kshera, and why would you use the term kshera to describe Yisraelis? Kshera lakahol, a woman who is mutter to marry other Jewish men, let's say to the exclusion of a mamzer. She's that she would not be allowed to marry. But she's kshera, she's allowed to marry kahal. Ihachi, the Gemara asks, if that is the way you want to learn the Mishnah, it said in the Mishnah, Yesh lo ach kosher. The Mishnah cited in this very example a cholol shenosek shera, and it said he has an ach that's kosher. So now, what does the word kosher mean? Nami kosher lakahol. Do you want to say that ach kosher means that he is kosher to the kahal, that the brother, he's kosher to the kahal? Michlal dehu pasul lakahal. Does that mean then that the cholol is someone that cannot marry into kahal? That's not true. A halal is simply someone who is disqualified from the kuna, but he marries Jewish women. He's not allowed to marry someone who's pasul lakahal. He's not allowed to marry a mamzeres, for example. Elolav kohen. When the Mishnah says that this cholol has a brother that's an ach kosher, it doesn't mean kosher lakahal. It means kohen kosher. Ach kosher means kosher kohen. Umidhu kohen. From the fact that kosher with regard to the brother means kohen, he kohenes. When it says that the cholol married a kshera, it means she's kshera to the kahuna. And if that be the case, then we would have a support to what Rav Yehuda Marav was saying, that lo huzru ksheros, women that are ksheros to the kahuna, are allowed to marry chalolim. The Gemara responds, Midi Irya, who says that it's speaking that way? Ha k'de'isa, the ha k'de'isa. The ach, he is kosher to the kahuna. And she, when it says she is kshera lakahal. Now, if you say that, then you would not have the support that we were looking for the original Rav Yehuda Amarav's teaching. Mosiv Rovin Bar Nachman. The Tanaic source quotes a pasuk that we have written on the side. Vayikra Perichof Aleph Pasuk Zayin. The pasuk reads, Isha Zoyno v'chalala lo yikochel. This pasuk is dealing with kohanim, and it says that kohanim are not allowed to marry a zoyno nor a chalala. Isha grusha meisha lo yikochu. A kohen is not allowed to marry a divorcee. Ki kadosh hu leilokov. In this pasuk, you see the term lo yikochu twice. So Ravin raises the following objection: Lo yikochu, lo yikochu. The double citing of that expression, malamed. Shoisha muzheres al yedei hoish. Now, the thinking right now is that we're coming to prohibit, mazhir, muzheres means warn against or prohibit, ksheros, that they should not marry a cholol. That's the thinking right now. Now, if you learn like that, you're then asking a kasha on Rav Yehuda Omar Rav. Omar Rava. Rava explains the Tanaic source in a different way, so that there is no kasha. There's no question on Rav Yehuda Amar Rav from this source. Rava says, Kol heicha dehu muzhar hi muzheres. What the Torah is telling me is that when the husband is prohibited, so she too is prohibited. V'chol heicha dehu lo muzhar, he lo mizdahara. Where he is not prohibited, for example, a cholol marrying a kshera, he is not prohibited, so she is not in violation either. Let's take a look at this in Rashi. Omar Rava kol hecha v'chulei v'hai kro lav lahazir ksheiros asi. The pasuk is not coming to serve as a prohibition to women that are kshera to the kuna. Elo lehazhir psulos shelo linosei l'ksherim. Rather, it's a warning to women that are psulos not to marry kohanim ksherim. Shekeshem shakoin musa shelo likach zoyna v'chalola kach hi musheres shelo tisoenu. Just like a kohen is prohibited in marrying a chalola, the chalola, who's a Jewish woman, she's also prohibited in being married to a kohen. So where he is also to marry her, she is also to marry him. However, where he is not also in marrying her, Rashi goes on, so she is not prohibited in marrying him. So at this point, Rav Yehuda Amar Rav is not under attack. The Gemara asks, is this concept of where he is warned, where he is prohibited, so she is likewise prohibited, is that learned from over here from the double expression of lo yikachu? Rav Yehuda Amar Rav nafka, from another teaching of Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, not the one above. The Yom Rav Yehuda Amar Rav v'chein tana debei Rabbi Yishmael. Likewise, it was taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yishmael. Ish o isha ki asu mikol chatoy sa'odam. That is a pasuk, and we learn from this pasuk where both man and woman are cited. Hishvo hakosav isha leish l'chol einshin shebetorah. The Torah compares a man to a woman with regard to all violations, all punishments in the Torah. That if the man is going to receive an onesh, when he is going to be, let's say, in violation of a negative command, the woman is also at the same time in violation of the negative command. So that if a kohen is warned against marrying the chalola is warned against marrying the kohen. So that you don't need, like Rava claimed, the double lo yikachu for that point. So then what is the double lo yikachu coming to teach? It would be apparently then a question on what Rav Yehuda Amar Rav wanted to say. The original Rav Yehuda Amar Rav that wanted to say lo uzuk sheres l'nos l'psum. It seems that they are. The Gemara responds, I mehahi. Had I just had this teaching of isha kiyasu mikol chatas adam, have amina, I would have thought that a woman is equated with a man only in lav hashava bakol, only in those kind of negative prohibitions in the Torah that are applicable to all. Just like a man is warned against eating horse meat, a woman is also warned against eating horse meat. So they're equated with regard to lavim, negative commands, that are shava bakol, that are applicable to all of the Jewish people. But when you're dealing with the negative commands that are Kohen related, they're not applicable to all. I would have thought that the women are not prohibited. Therefore, I need lo yikachu, so that in effect we reinstate Rava's answer. And that is a good defense of Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. The Gemara asks, Varei, we're at the top line of Pehei Amud Aleph, Varei Tum'ah. The laws concerning ritual impurity. Delav She'ein Shava Bakol. The laws of ritual impurity apply to Kohanim and not to Yisraelim. when we say the laws, we're referring to some specific areas of these rules, and Rashi cites the source for it, the pasuk that says Emor el kohanim, where kohanim are warned against defiling themselves, and Yisraelim are not warned against defiling themselves. That's a lav she'ein shava bakol. Now, in that topic of tumah, women are actually exempt. It's an example of a lav she'ein shabakol. The taima de kosav rachmona b'nei Aaron v'lo b'nos Aaron. Only because in the pasuk cited Emor lakonim, it says Emor lakonim b'nei Aaron. It's an extra expression, that b'nei Aaron. So from that we learn b'nei Aaron, which is in the masculine form. The men folk are warned, not the women folk. Ha lav hachi. If not for that extra expression b'nei Aaron, I would have thought that women are also prohibited, or bound, are duty bound, or warned against defilement. And we're talking once again about a case of a lav she'ein shava bakol. My taima, why would have I thought that women are also restricted like the men folk? Lav mishum de Rav Yehuda Marav. Is it not because of that teaching of ish o isha? So that we see from here that Isha Isha, that pasuk applies not only to Lav HaShava Bakol, but even to Lav She'eno Shava Bakol. So if that be the case, I don't need the Lo Yikochu teaching like Rava said. No. De Gamrinon Mi Lo Yikochu. It is very specifically because of Lo Yikochu that I would have thought that the women are duty bound, namely that Lo Yikochu addresses the paralleling of women to the men folk in cases of Lav She'eno Shava Bakol. And that's why I need the B'nei Aaron v'lo b'nos Aaron to exempt them. But as far as, so just to repeat that last point, the double Lo Yikachu, in fact, is, like Rava explained, is to cover the cases of Lav Shein Shava Bakol, to equate the women to the men. But as far as the original Rav Yehuda Marav teaching about Ksheros as being Lo Muzhoros, that halacha stands and is not challenged by the double Lo Yikachu found in the source. Ika, the Amri, another version. Kicha, it's the Richale. I need the double Lo Yikachu. Salka daita chamina ligmar mituma. I might have thought to learn from the case of Tuma, where we saw that in a Lav Sheinu Shava Bakol, the women were actually exempt. Komash Malon, the double Lo Yikachu comes to teach me that even in cases where it's a Lav Sheinu Shava Bakol, like in the case of the Kohen marrying a Chalola, just like the Kohen is prohibited marrying the Chalola, which is a Kohen related matter, it's a Lav Shein Shabakol, the Chalola is also usher in marrying the Kohen. If I didn't have that double Lo Yikachu, I would have allowed the Tuma case to serve as the precedent that when it comes to a Lav Shein Shabakol, the women would have been exempt. The Gemara continues, Bo Minayu, we skipped a couple words there. Rav Papa, Rav Huna, Breder, Rav Yeshua, Iklu, Lehinsevu. These two rabbis, Rav Papa and Rav Huna, visited a place called Hinsevu, the Asrei Rav Idi Barov, and that was the town in which Rav Idi was the Rov. He was the rabbi, the head of the Jewish community. Bo Minayu. These rabbis, the visitors, Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the question was asked of them, Huzuru Ksheros Linosa Psulim Olo, are women that are Kehanois, are they prohibited in marrying Chalolim? This, of course, is the topic that we had been discussing till now, namely Rav Yehuda Marav's halacha. So they were asked that as a question. Omar Luhu Rav Papa. So Rav Papa answers. He tries to answer. Tanisua. Then you'll notice that this is we're calling this a long marking. We're calling it Rav Papa to show how far his
point goes. He cites a Tanaic source. This Tanaic source is a Mishnah that you find in the last parak of Maseches Kiddushin, and it deals with the different categories of people that came back to the land of Israel at the time of Ezra, after the Babylonian exile. And it says, Asora Yuchsin Olu Mibovel. There are 10 different categories of genealogy that came to Israel back from the Babylonian exile. The 10 are Kohanim, Leviim, V'Yisraelim, Chalolim, Gerim, V'Charum. Charum means Meshuchror, an Eved that was freed. Umamzerim, Nesinim, Shtuki Vasufi. Shtuki Vasufi are different examples of people whose parenthood is not known. A Shtuki is a person who knows who his mother is but doesn't know who his father is. And Asufi is literally someone gathered in from the market. You know, the classic baby left in a basket story where he doesn't know who his parents are. So there are 10 different categories. Kohanim, Levi, Yisraelim, Mutorin, Lovo, Zebozeh. Men and women folk of these categories of Kohanim, Levi, Yisraelim, they can marry one another. Leviim, Yisraelim, Chalolim, Gerim, Harurim, Mutorim, Lovo, Zebozeh. Likewise, men and women folk of these categories can marry one another. Geri, Haruri, Umamzeri, Nesini, Shtuki, Vasufi, Mutorim, Lovo, Zebozeh. And likewise, these categories of people can marry one another. So this source contains all of those categories of people that are allowed to marry one another. What you don't find in this, Ve'ilu Kaihanos Lecholo Lo Kotoni. It doesn't say in this source, the source mentions Kaihanim in it, but it doesn't mention, and it mentions Kaihanim, men, women, folk, being allowed to marry. Leviim and Yisraelim. That's Kaihanim, Leviim, Yisraelim can marry one another, but it doesn't say Kaihanim can marry Chalolim, or Kaihanos, the women folk of Kaihanim, can marry a Cholol. So it seems from here, according to Rav Papa, that they would be prohibited, that a Cholol cannot marry a Kshera. Amar le Rav Huna B'Rav Yehoshua. Rav Huna says that the absence of that teaching in this source does not prove prohibition, because what this source wanted to teach was as follows: Kol heicha dahani nasvi mehani v'hani nasvi mehani kotoni. Wherever you have a two-way street, where the male example can marry the female example, and the female example can marry the male example, that's what was taught. Kohen. But when you come to the realm of kahuna, Kevon di'ilu boi leminsav chalola asirole, since with regard to the Kohen Cholol situation, the man version, the man Kohen, cannot marry a Chalola. So that's why it didn't teach the case of Chalola who is allowed, who would be allowed to marry a Kohen. So since it doesn't conform to the series that the source provided, it wasn't taught. But what comes out, as far as Rav Huna B'Rav Yehoshua is concerned, as far as this source is concerned, Ksheros are not prohibited in marrying Chalolim. Asu l'kamei de Rav Idi bar Oven. So they came in front of Rav Idi, Omar Lahu, and Rav Idi apparently was an elder type rabbinic figure. He says, Dardiki. Dardiki is an expression meaning youngsters. Maybe he was saying to them, young men. Hachi Omar Rav Yehuda Marav. In fact, I have a tradition from Rav Yehuda Marav, Lo Huzaru Ksheros Linosei Lipsulim. In fact, what Rav Huna B'Rav Yehoshua was trying to reason, he has as a solid tradition.